to introduce Dr. Pim Van Lommel, and if you come to the stage, you can take us all on a magnificent journey right here, right now. Thank you so much for coming all the way from the stage.
So, thank you for the kind words. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased that I get the opportunity to discuss here today my concept of non-local consciousness, based on scientific research on near-death experiences in survivors of cardiac arrest. A near-death experience, or an experience of enhanced consciousness during a period of apparent coma, still gives rise to many unbelieving and critical questions, especially by physicians and neuroscientists. But as already 1 century ago William James has said, to study the abnormal is the best way of understanding the normal. How can it scientifically be explained that people can have clear memories from a period of obvious unconsciousness? Or how is it possible that permanent life changes occur after cardiac arrest of only 2 minutes? And NDE is the unforgettable confrontation with the unlimited dimensions in our consciousness. As long as one not has experienced an NDE himself, it seems impossible to really understand the impact and the life-changing after effects of this overwhelming experience. The existing worldview has radically changed. Quote, "It felt as if I had become another person, but with the same personality, the same identity." Another quote, "You can be physically dead, but your mind lives on. Only one thing matters, your attitude toward other people. I accept life as it is, and I'm no longer afraid of death." I will not only talk about changes in consciousness during and after an NDE, but above all, I want to discuss my ideas about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. Important questions for me were, how is consciousness related to the integrity of brain function? Is it possible to gain insight in this relationship? And is there a biological basis of consciousness anyway? We can distinguish between both temporary and timeless aspects of our consciousness. This prompts the following question: is it possible to speak of a beginning of our consciousness, and will our consciousness ever end? I realized that my approach will be new or unexpected for most neuroscientists, and that my conclusions will not always be in conformity with the currently widely accepted materialistic paradigm in Western science. And I also realized that many aspects of consciousness are still a great mystery. It just functioned.
I just manually flow.
Oh, it's now. You did it?
Yeah, I just manually did that one.
That's strange.
Yeah.
It just happened to. Oh, now it's working again. Okay, thank you. How started my interest in near-death experiences? In 1969, during my rotating internship, a patient was successfully resuscitated in the coronary care unit by electrical defibrillation. In those days, this was all new and exciting for us. We mostly do not realize anymore that until 1967, about 50 years ago, all patients with cardiac arrest died because modern resuscitation techniques like defibrillation and external chest compression were not yet available. But this patient regained consciousness after a period of unconsciousness of about 4 minutes. And we as resuscitation team were of course very happy. But the patient seemed to be very, very disappointed. He told me about going through a tunnel, seeing a light and also beautiful colors and hearing music. I have never forgotten this event, but I did not do anything with it. And in that time I did not know that in human history the same experiences have been told in many cultures, in many religions and in all times, as is shown in this painting from in 1480 by the Dutch painter Johannes Bos, showing deceased people escorted through a tunnel to the light. And only years later, in 1975, Raymond Moody first described these so-called near-death experiences. But only in 1986, I read about these experiences in the book by George Ritchie entitled Return from Tomorrow, which relates what he experienced during a period of clinical death of 9 minutes duration in 1943 during his medical study. And after reading this book, I started to interview my patients who had survived a cardiac arrest. And to my great surprise, within 2 years, 12 patients out of 50 patients of cardiac arrest in the past told me about their NDE. For me, it all started with scientific curiosity, because according to our current medical concept, it is not possible to experience this consciousness during cardiac arrest when circulation and breathing have ceased. I grew up in an academic environment in which I had been taught that it was obvious that consciousness was the product of a functional brain. And until that point, I had always accepted this as indisputably true. But now, the phenomenon of near-death experience raised a number of fundamental questions. How and why does an NDE occur? And how does the content of an NDE come about? And why does a person's life change so radically after an NDE? I was unable to accept most of the answers to these questions because they seemed incomplete, incorrect, or unfounded. Now, but first, what is a near-death experience, an NDE? Some people who have survived a life-threatening crisis report an extraordinary conscious experience. And the NDE can be defined as the reported memory of a range of impressions during a special state of consciousness, including a number of universal elements, such as an out-of-body experience, pleasant feelings, seeing a tunnel, a light, deceased relatives, a life review, or the conscious return to the body. And many circumstances are described during which an NDE is reported, such as cardiac arrest, clinical death, shock after loss of blood, complicated childbirth, coma following traumatic brain injury or stroke, near drowning, children, or asphyxia, but also in serious diseases not immediately life-threatening, and also they mentioned during depression, isolation, or meditation, or without any obvious reason. And similar experiences to near-death ones can occur during the terminal phase of illness and are called death threat visions or end-of-life experiences. So apparently you don't always need a non-functioning brain to report a near-death experience. The NDE is transformational, always causing profound changes in life insight, the loss of the fear of death, and enhanced intuitive sensitivity. And this is why these kind of experiences are also called spiritual transformational experiences, or STE. Now, near-death experiences occur with increasing frequency because of the improved survival rates resulting from modern techniques of resuscitation and from better treatment for patients with cerebral trauma. The content of an NDE and the effects on patients seem similar worldwide across all cultures and all times. However, the subjective nature and the absence of a frame of reference for this experience lead to individual, cultural, and religious factors determining the vocabulary used to describe and interpret the experience. Children or adults, Christians or atheists, Muslims and Buddhists, they all use different words from their own religion, culture, and tradition. In essence, is the NDE an ineffable experience? And according to a recent random poll in Germany and the USA, about 4% of the total population in the Western world should have experienced an NDE. So more than 10 million people in the USA and about 20 million people in Europe must have had an NDE. Now, why do we physicians hardly ever hear a patient tell about his NDE? Patients are so reluctant to share their experience with others by all the negative responses they get. Patients must feel that you trust them, that you can listen without prejudice or without any comment. But for most physicians, the NDE is still incomprehensible and unknown phenomenon. Now, once a conference was held about NDE in a university hospital with more than 300 people in attendance. And at the end of the conference, after several lectures about NDE, a man stood up and said, "I'm a cardiologist for more than 25 years, and I've never heard such absurd stories. This is total nonsense. I don't believe one word of it." Then another man stood up in the audience and said, "I'm one of your patients. I have had an NDE during cardiac arrest, and you would be the last one I would ever tell." They know and feel exactly that these kind of physicians are not able to listen at all. Now, until recently, there was no prospective and scientifically designed study to explain the cause and content of an NDE. All studies have been retrospective and very selective in respect to patients. Based on these incomplete retrospective studies, some believed the experience could be caused by physiological changes in the brain as a result of lack of oxygen, cerebral anoxia. Other theories encompass a psychological reaction to approaching death, hallucinations, dreams, side effects of drugs, or just false memories. So in 1988, we started a prospective study of 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals with the aim to investigate the frequency, the cause and content of an NDE. And this cartoon was published in a Dutch national newspaper when our study was published in the Lancet in December 2001. We wanted to know if there could be a physiological, pharmacological, psychological or demographic explanation why people experience enhanced consciousness during a period of cardiac arrest. And we did a short standardized interviews with sufficiently recovered patients within a few days of resuscitation and asked whether they could remember the period of unconsciousness and what they recalled. And we additionally performed a longitudinal study. Now we studied patients who survived cardiac arrest because this is a well-described, life-threatening medical situation, which is also called clinical death. The definition of clinical death was used for a period of unconsciousness caused by lack of oxygen or anoxia of the brain due to an arrest of circulation and breathing that happens during cardiac arrest in patients with an acute myocardial infarction. These patients will ultimately die from irreversible damage to the brain if cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, is not initiated within 5 to 10 minutes. It is the closest model of the process of dying. In cases where memories were reported, we coded the experience according to a weighted core experience index. And this is a system, the depth of the NDE was measured according to the reported elements of the content of the NDE. The more elements you reported, the deeper the experience was and the higher the resulting score was. So we found that 282 patients, 82%, had no recollection of the period of cardiac arrest, of the period of unconsciousness. However, 62 patients, 18%, reported some recollection of the time of clinical death. And of these patients, 41 patients, 12% reported a core experience with a score of 6 or higher and 6% had a superficial NDE. Now, which elements were reported? In our study, about 50% of the patients with an NDE reported awareness of being dead or had positive emotions. About 25% of the patients had an out-of-body experience. 30% reported moving through a tunnel. About 25% had communication with the light of observed colors. About 30% of the patients had an observation of a celestial landscape or had a meeting with deceased relatives. 13% experienced a live review and 8% experienced a border. So in our study, all well-known elements were reported except a frightening NDE, but I know personally have met several people who had a frightening near-death experience. Now, what might distinguish the small percentage of patients who report an NDE from those who do not? We found, to our surprise, that neither the duration of cardiac arrest, 2 minutes or 8 minutes, nor the duration of unconsciousness, 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, nor the need for intubation in complicated CPR, nor induced cardiac arrest in electrophysiological stimulation, EPS, had any influence on the frequency of NDE, and as is not significant. So the degree or gravity of the lack of oxygen in the brain, anoxia, appeared to be irrelevant. So a physiological explanation for NDE like anoxia could be excluded in our study. Neither could we find any relationship between the frequency of NDE and administered drugs, the fear of death before the arrest, nor foreknowledge of NDE, that you know that these experiences are possible, gender, religion, if you were atheist or Christian, didn't matter at all, or education. Now, we additionally performed a longitudinal study with taped interviews 2 and 8 years following the cardiac arrest of all late survivors with an NDE, along with a matched control group of survivors of cardiac arrest who did not report an NDE. And the study was designed to assess whether the loss of the fear of death, the transformation in attitude toward life, and enhanced intuitive sensitivity is the result of having an NDE or just the result of the cardiac arrest itself. This had never been studied before in a prospective design. Now, the NDE turned out to be a life-changing experience because only patients with an NDE did show this aforementioned typical transformation. In particular, they were less afraid of death and had a stronger belief in an afterlife. And we saw them in greater interest in spirituality and in questions about the purpose of life, as well as a greater acceptance of and love for oneself, in combination with a feeling of oneness with others and with nature. The conversations we had in our longitudinal study revealed that people, to their own amazement and confusion, had acquired enhanced intuitive feelings after an NDE. Or as many of them put them, they had acquired paranormal gifts. And this enhanced intuition is based on interconnectedness with the consciousness of others, and is independent of time, and in a knowing of future events or having prognostic dreams, and is independent of distance, the sense of knowing about an incoming phone call or of pain, illness, of upcoming death of people, which usually proves to be accurate. And the sudden occurrence of this enhanced intuition can be quite problematic, as people suddenly have the very acute sense of others, which can be extremely intimidating. As someone told me, I couldn't even talk about it, or I would have been committed to an institution. And I know people with NDE who have been committed to an institution because they kept on talking. Finally, it is quite remarkable and unsurprising and unexpected finding to see a cardiac arrest lasting just a few minutes give rise to such a lifelong process of transformation. However, the integration and acceptance of an NDE is a process that may take may take many years because of a far-reaching impact on people's pre-NDE understanding of life and value system. Despite the mostly positive experience, the NDE is also a traumatic event because there is hardly any acceptance by doctors, nurses, family, and partner, with a more than 70% divorce rate. They say, it's not the partner I married 20 years before. Which makes the process of acceptance and integration very difficult. And this process will take many, many years with strong feelings of loneliness, depression, and homesickness. But the longer the interval between NDE and the interview, the more positive changes are usually reported. Now, several theories have been proposed to explain the NDE. However, in our first prospective study ever, it could not be shown that psychological, pharmacological, or physiological factors cause these experiences during cardiac arrest. With a purely physiological explanation, such as lack of oxygen in the brain, most patients who had been clinical death should report an NDE, because all patients in our study had been unconscious because of lack of oxygen in the brain resulting from the cardiac arrest. However, only 18% reported an NDE. And why only 18% reported an NDE after cardiac arrest is still a big mystery. Besides, it's a well-established fact that people without any lack of oxygen in the brain, like in depression or meditation, can also experience an enhanced consciousness. So another theory holds that NDE might be a changing state of consciousness, or the theory of continuity, in which memories, identity, and cognition, with emotion, function independently from the unconscious body, retain the possibility of extrasensory perception. Obviously, during NDE, enhanced consciousness is experienced independently from the normal body-linked waking consciousness. In 4 prospective studies with identical study design, our Dutch study, the only study with statistical analysis, 1 study from the USA, and 2 studies from the UK, about the same percentage of NDE was found in a total of 562 patients who survived cardiac arrest. And all authors conclude that no one physiological or psychological model by itself could explain all the common features of an NDE. So Bruce Grayson from the American study writes in his comment that the paradoxical occurrence of heightened and lucid awareness and logical thought processes during a period of impaired cerebral perfusion raises particular perplexing questions for our current understanding of consciousness and its relation with brain function. A clear sensorium and complex perceptual processes during a period of apparent clinical death challenge the concept that consciousness is localized exclusively in the brain. As Sampari and Peter Fenwick from the British study write that the data from several NDE studies suggest that the NDE arises during unconsciousness. And this is a surprising conclusion because when the brain is so dysfunctional that the patient is deeply comatose, those cerebral structures which underpin subjective experience and memory must be severely impaired. Complex experiences such as reported NDE should not arise or be retained in memory. Such patients would be expected to have no subjective experience at all. And Penny Sartori from the other British study concluded that according to mainstream science, it is quite impossible to find a scientific explanation for the NDE as long as we believe that consciousness is only a side effect of a functioning brain. The fact that people report lucid experiences in their consciousness when the brain activity has ceased is, in her view, difficult to reconcile with current medical opinion. Now, with lack of evidence for any other theory for NDE, the concept, this far assumed, but never scientifically proven that consciousness and memories are produced by a large group of neurons and are localized in the brain should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death, even with a flatline EEG? And furthermore, even blind people have described veridical perceptions during out-of-body experience at the time of their NDE. So scientific study of NDE pushes us to the limits of our medical and neurophysiological ideas about the range of human consciousness and the mind-brain relation. Before I discuss in greater detail some neurophysiological aspects of a normal brain function and during cardiac arrest, I would like to reconsider certain elements of the NDE. And first, the out-of-body experience. In this experience, people have veridical perception from a position outside and above their lifeless body. The NDEs have the feeling that they have apparently taken off their body as an old coat, and to their surprise, they appear to have retained their own identity with the possibility of perception, emotions, and a very clear consciousness. And this out-of-body experience is scientifically important because doctors, nurses, and relatives can verify the reported perceptions, and they can also corroborate the precise moment the NDE with OB occurred during this period of CPR. And in a recent review by Jen Holden from IANS, and in the recent book, The Self Does Not Die, more than 160 corroborated reports of potentially verifiable out-of-body experiences, perceptions during NDE were published. And it was found that about 90% of the reported OBs were completely accurate. Through verification, it was proven that all reported perceptions during coma, cardiac arrest, or general anesthesia were about details that really had happened. And 8% contained only a minor error, and 2% was completely erroneous. And it proves that an OB cannot be an hallucination, because it means an experience and a perception that has no basis in reality, like in psychosis. Neither it can be a delusion, which is an incorrect assessment of a correct perception, nor an illusion, which means a misapprehensive or misleading image. And moreover, one needs a functioning brain to experience hallucinations, delusions, or illusions. And it has never been proven that you can induce an out-of-body experience during stimulation of the brain. There have been some articles in medical journals, but they just describe illusions, but not real out-of-body experiences. A real OBE is clearly shown in this drawing of a 6-year-old girl who was nearly drowned and was resuscitated in the hospital. In this drawing, you see a happy and smiling girl watching a resuscitation from above. Here, she saw her own resuscitation here. With many correct details, like chest compression by 2 nurses, and a 6-year-old girl doesn't know anything about chest compression. And this is the report from a nurse of a coronary care unit. During night shift, an ambulance brings in a 43-year-old cyanotic, comatose man into the coronary care unit. He was found in a coma about 30 minutes before in a meadow. When we go to intubate the patient, he turns out to have dentures in his mouth. I removed these upper dentures and put them onto the crash cart. Only after about an hour and a half, the patient has sufficient heart rhythm and blood pressure, but he's still ventilated and intubated, and he is still comatose. He is transferred to the intensive care unit to continue the necessary artificial respiration for 1 week. So after more than a week in coma, I do meet again with the patient who is by now back on the cardiac ward. The moment he sees me, he said, "Oh, you know where my dentures are." I am very, very surprised. And then the patient elucidates, you were there when I was brought into hospital, and you took my dentures out of my mouth and put them into this cart. It had all these bottles on it, and there was this sliding drawer underneath, and there you put my teeth. And I was especially amazed because I remember this happening while the man was in deep coma and in the process of CPR. It appeared that the man had seen himself lying in bed, that he had perceived from above how nurses and doctors had been busy with the CPR. He was also able to describe correctly and in detail the small room in which he was resuscitated, where he was admitted in coma and had left in coma, as well as the appearances of those present like myself. And then the holographic life review. During this life review, the subject feels the presence and renewed experience of not only every act, but also of every thought from one's past life. And one realizes that all of it is an energy field which influences oneself as well as others. All that had been done and thought seems to be significant and stored. Because one is connected with the memories, emotions, and consciousness of another person, you experience the consequences of your own thoughts, words, and actions to that other person at the very moment in the past that they occurred. Interconnectedness. And patients survey their whole life in one glance. Time and space do not seem to exist during such an period, such an experience. Non-locality. Quote, all of my life up till the present seems to be placed before me in a kind of panoramic, three-dimensional review. And each event seemed to be accompanied by a consciousness of good or evil, with an insight into cause and effect. Not only did I perceive everything from my own viewpoint, but I also knew the thoughts of everyone involved in the event, as if I had their thoughts within me. This meant that I perceived not only what I had done or thought, but even in what way it had influenced others, as if I saw things with all-seeing eyes. And so even your thoughts are apparently never wiped out. Consider the impact of this statement for a moment. Your thoughts are never wiped out. And all the time, during the review, the importance of love was emphasized. Looking back, I cannot say how long this time life review and life insight lasted. It may have been long, for every subject came up, but at the same time, it seemed just a fraction of a second, because I perceived it all at the same time. Time and distance seemed not to exist. I was in all places at the same time. And sometimes my attention was drawn to something, then I would be present there. People can talk for days, but they experience it in a cardiac arrest of 1 or 2 minutes. There's no time in the experience. And also a preview or a flash forward can be experienced. People feel like they can see a part of the life that is yet to come. And again, it seems as if time and space do not exist during this preview, also non-locality. Quote, and in a flash I saw the rest of my life. I could see a large part of my future life, taking care of my children, my wife's illness, everything that would happen to me, both in and out of the workplace. I could see it all. I foresaw my wife's death and my mother's passing. One day I wrote down all the things I saw back then, and over the years I have been able to tick them all off. For instance, I saw my wife on her deathbed, wrapped in a white shawl, just like the one she was given by a friend of hers some days before she died. And it is also possible to come in contact with the consciousness of deceased persons, interconnectedness. Quote, during my cardiac arrest, I had an extensive experience, and later I saw apart from my deceased grandmother a man who had looked at me lovingly, but whom I did not know. More than 10 years later, at my mother's deathbed, she confessed to me that I had been born out of an extramarital relationship. My father being a Jewish man who had been deported and killed during the Second World War. And my mother showed me his picture. The unknown man that I had seen more than 10 years before during my NDE turned out to be my biological father. Now, some patients can describe how they returned into their body, mostly through the top of the head, after they had come to understand that it wasn't their time yet, or that they still had a task to fulfill. The conscious return into the body is experienced as something very oppressive. They regain consciousness in their body and realize that they are locked up in their damaged body, meaning again all the pain and restriction of their disease. Quote, "When I came to in my body, it was dreadful, so dreadful. The experience had been so beautiful that I didn't want to come back. I wanted to stay there, and yet I came back. From that moment, it was a real struggle to live my life inside my body, with all the limitations I experienced at the time. But later I realized that this experience was in fact a blessing. For now I know that the mind and body are separate and that there's life after death." So about all people who have experienced an NDE lose their fear of death. Quote, "It is outside my domain to discuss something that can only be proven by death. For me, however, this blessing experience was decisive in convincing me that consciousness lives on beyond the grave. And I know now for sure that body and mind are separated. Death was not death, but another form of life." So we have to come to the surprising conclusion that in our study during cardiac arrest, all these reported elements of an NDE were experienced during a transient functional loss of all of the cortex and of the brainstem, with the flatline EEG. But how do we know that the EEG is flat in those patients with cardiac arrest, and how can we study this? Through many studies with induced cardiac arrest, both in humans, we did it in threshold testing and implementation of internal defibrillators, ICDs, but also in animal models, cerebral function has been shown to be severely compromised during cardiac arrest, with complete cessation of cerebral flow, causing the clinical findings of the sudden loss of consciousness, the loss of breathing, apnea, the loss of all body reflexes, function of the cortex, but also the loss of all brainstem reflexes like the gag reflex, the caudal reflex, and widened and fixed dilated pupils. And the electrical activity of the cerebral cortex, but also in deeper structures in the brain in animals, have been shown to be absent after 10 to 20 seconds, a flatline EEG. And in acute myocardial infarction, the duration of cardiac arrest is always longer than 20 seconds. So all 562 survivors of cardiac arrest in the 4 prospective studies must have had a flatline EEG. Now, it is extremely rare that a simultaneous registration of the electric activity of the heart ECG, this is the red line, it is the ECG, electric activity of the heart, and the electric activity of the cortex, that is the EEG, is shown simultaneously during cardiac arrest. But the simultaneous registration of an ECG and EEG is shown here. The patient was referred because of certain periods of unconsciousness, and during the registration of 60 seconds, each strip is 10 seconds up here. A spontaneous cardiac arrest and asystole with loss of consciousness occur. Up here, electric activity of the heart stops, a cardiac arrest. So there's now no activity of the heart whatsoever. And the EEG started to change after 10 seconds. It becomes more like this. And after 18 seconds, also EEG, the electric activity of the brain, has totally ceased, it's flatlined. So a cardiac arrest gives rise to a systole of the EEG. And after 30 seconds of cardiac arrest, a ventricular tachycardia occurs up here, with a slow, better activity of the heart, and also the EEG comes later back. The patient received a pacemaker, after which he remained complaint-free. But this is the proof that with cardiac arrest, the EEG flatlines within 10 to 20 seconds. The conclusion about conscious experience during a flattened EEG is often called impossible and unscientific. The quite often proposed objection that the flatline EEG does not rule out any brain activity because it is mainly a registration of the electrical activity of the cerebral cortex misses the mark. The issue is not whether there is any brain activity of any kind whatsoever, but whether there is the measurable brain activity of the specific form regarded by contemporary neuroscience as a necessary condition for conscious experience, with visible activities in many neural centers, the so-called global neural workspace. And it has been proven that there is no such specific brain activity at all during cardiac arrest. So for me, it was indeed a scientific challenge to discuss new hypotheses that could explain the possibility of a clear and enhanced consciousness during a transient period of a non-functioning brain, with memories, with self-identity, with cognition, with emotion, with the possibility of perception out and above the lifeless body. To explain the interconnectedness with the consciousness of other persons in the past and with deceased relatives. To explain the possibility to experience instantaneously and simultaneously non-locality, a review and a preview of someone's life in a dimension without our conventional body-link concept of time and space, where all past, present and future events exist, and even to explain the experience of the conscious return into the body. Most materialist scientists still don't believe in the possibility to experience an enhanced consciousness during a period of a non-functioning brain. And they try to debunk everything I've said and written by simply stating that obviously the NDE must be produced by the brain. They only change their mind as soon as they have experienced an NDE themselves, like Alan Alexander and other physicians. So my advice to these debunkers is, try this small and dangerous footpath and find out yourself. Well, in a recently released book, Consciousness Beyond Life, which was a bestseller with more than 250,000 copies sold worldwide, and has been translated in many languages, I've written that based on prospective studies on NDE, based on recent findings in neurophysiological research, and based on concepts from quantum physics, our consciousness cannot be localized in a certain time or space. And this is called non-local consciousness beyond time and beyond space. Now, in this concept, our endless or non-local consciousness with declarative memories finds its origin in and is stored in non-local realm as wave fields of information. And the brain only serves as a relay station for parts of these wave fields of the consciousness to be received into or as our awakened consciousness. The function of the brain should so be compared with a transceiver, a transmitter-receiver, or interface, exactly like the function of a computer. Different neuronal networks function as interface for different aspects of our consciousness. And the function of neuronal networks should be regarded as receivers and conveyors, but not as retainers of consciousness and memories. And this concept, non-local consciousness, is not rooted in the measurable domain of physics, our manifest world. However, the physical aspects of consciousness, which originates from the wave aspects of a consciousness through collapse of the wave function, objective reduction, can be measured by means of neuroimaging techniques like EEG, fMRI, and PET scan. And with this concept of non-local consciousness, all reported elements of an NDE during cardiac arrest could be explained. Now, in trying to understand this concept of interaction between non-local consciousness and the material body, it seems appropriate to compare it with modern worldwide communication. There is a continuous exchange of objective information by means of electromagnetic fields for radio, TV, mobile telephone or laptop computer. And at this very moment, we are invaded by hundreds of thousands of telephone calls and hundreds of television and radio programs. But we become only aware of these electromagnetic informative fields at the moment we use our mobile telephone or by switching on our radio, TV or laptop computer. And what we receive is neither inside the instrument nor in the components, but thanks to the receiver, the information from the electromagnetic fields, the cloud, becomes observable to our senses and hence perception occurs in our consciousness. Internet with more than 1 billion websites can be received at about the same moment in the USA, in Europe and in Australia, and it's obvious not located inside our laptop, nor is it produced by it. Information from internet is always and everywhere available because it is stored in the cloud. And this concept can be compared with non-local consciousness. It is always everywhere inside and outside the body. Now we can conclude that our waking consciousness, or ego, which we experience as our daily consciousness, is only a part of our whole or endless non-local consciousness, which also can be called universal consciousness or cosmic consciousness or divine consciousness. And this view of a non-local consciousness allows us to understand a wide variety of special states of consciousness, such as can be experienced during critical medical situation, a near-death experience, or during an acute situation or apparently unavoidable death, like in an imminent traffic accident or mountaineering accident and fear-death experience. And these experiences are also reported during meditation or deep relaxation, the mystical or religious or enlightened experience, but also during changing states of consciousness during regression therapy, hypnosis, hypnagogia, severe depression, isolation, like astronauts or lost in the desert or shipwrecks, or the use of drugs like LSD or DMT, dimethyltryptamine or ayahuasca. And these experiences of enhanced consciousness may also occur during the terminal phase of the life, the deathbed vision or end-of-life experience. During the end of life, sometimes people report encounters with deceased loved ones who welcome them, or the sight of a beautiful, unearthly environment with a bright light, or a sense of unconditional love. The content of such deathbed visions can bear a striking resemblance to an NDE. Like an NDE, the deathbed vision takes away the fear of death. Unfortunately, many accounts of deathbed visions are not either recognized as such or are interpreted as hallucinations, terminal confusions, or as the side effects of medication. And a shared death experience or empathetic NDE. And this experience is caused by the strong emotion felt upon the death of a dearly loved person. A healthy and empathetic person may share, as it were, in the death experience of another person who is dying or has just died. And then they are suddenly back in their body and at the bedside of the deceased relative. The content of this shared death experience may be identical with a near-death experience. The interconnectedness with non-local aspects of consciousness also explain apparitions at the moment of death, like being in contact with the non-local aspects of consciousness of a dying person on a distance, the so-called perimortal experience, where they receive information about the moment of death and even something about how and where they died. And this information could not be known at the moment. Most of these perimortal experiences occur at night during sleep, but the experiences are far more clear than a dream and are never forgotten. The so-called postmortal experience or after-death communication, or ADC, is the inner feeling of knowing, to be in contact with the consciousness of a deceased person. It is still a big taboo to talk about the sensation of being in contact with a deceased loved one during the weeks, months, or years after his or her death. And is sometimes accompanied by communication, certain fragrances, or unexpected chance incidents that are intuitively linked with a dead person. People share these experiences only when they feel a great deal of trust and know that they will not be at the receiving end of prejudice and negative comments like, it is just wishful thinking, or it is your grief talking. These experiences also mostly occur during sleep, and this is why they usually call it just a dream. I dreamt of my deceased mother or father. These post-mortal experiences, or ADC, are still a huge taboo in the Western world, despite the fact that about 125 million people in Europe and about 1 million people in the US must have had an after-death communication. The fact that contact is possible with the consciousness of a deceased relative is usually very comforting and helpful in the period of mourning. And healthcare workers or family members should not call an ADC an hallucination or a dream. The result of an ADC, after-death communication, is that usually the fear for their own death will disappear as well. Now, the interconnectedness with these informative fields of non-local consciousness also explains enhanced intuition, like clairvoyance, clairaudience, telepathy, prognostic dreams, and visions, the non-local information exchange. As I told before, following an NDE, most people, often to their own amazement and confusion, may experience such an enhanced intuitive sensitivity, which means having access to non-local information that is not received by our senses or by our body. Presumably, the functional receiving capacity of the body and the brain is permanently enhanced following an NDE, which can be compared with a radio receiving not only channel 1, your own personal consciousness, but at the same time channel 3, 2, 4, 5, or 6, the consciousness of others. William James called this a lower personal threshold of consciousness. And this remote non-local communication or entanglement seems also to be demonstrated in remote viewing, the non-local perception, and in the effect of consciousness on matter, like a non-local perturbation, as in neuroplasticity, where in EEG, fMRI, and PET scan studies, functional and structural changes in the brain are demonstrated following changes in consciousness, like in meditation, mindfulness of training, or in placebo treatment with patients with depression, chronic pain, or with Parkinson's disease. There's structural and functional changing in the brain, which obviously leaves us only one conclusion: it is mind over matter. Since the publication of several prospective studies on NDE and survivors of cardiac arrest with strikingly similar results and conclusions, the phenomenon of the NDE can no longer be scientifically ignored. It is an authentic experience which cannot be simply reduced to imagination, fear of death, hallucination, psychosis, the use of drugs, or oxygen deficiency. And people appear to be permanently changed by an NDE during cardiac arrest of only some minutes duration. According to these studies, the current materialistic view of the relationship between the brain and consciousness held by most physicians, philosophers, and psychologists is too restricted for a proper understanding of this phenomenon. Materialistic science starts principally from a reality that is only based on physical, observable data. But we should be aware that besides external so-called objective perception and observation, there are also subjective, not observable, and not demonstrable aspects, like thoughts, feelings, inspiration, and intuition. We can only measure the electrical, magnetic, and chemical activities in the brain by EEG, MEG, and PET scan. And we can measure changes in blood flow in the brain by fMRI. But these are only neural correlates of consciousness. These measurements do not explain anything about the production, more about the content of consciousness. With our currently available scientific and objective techniques, one is not able even to prove, to measure, to objectify, or to falsify the content of the subjective experiences in our consciousness. Direct proof about how neurons or the neural networks would possibly produce the subjective essence of our thoughts or feelings is totally missing. By making a scientific case for consciousness as a non-local and thus ubiquitous phenomenon, this view can contribute to new ideas about the relationship between consciousness and the brain.
The question is about the skeptic reactions. Now, there have been some skeptical responses in the Netherlands, but there have been skeptical responses all over the world. Like you know better than I know what Sam Harris wrote about Eben Alexander is incredible. And so, because it doesn't fit in their materialistic concepts, they attack it. They're afraid to lose their scientific ground. They're afraid to lose the materialistic dogma, because there will be a change in paradigm, which is called the post-materialist science as well. Has been written a book by Ed Kelly, Beyond Physicalism, which is a wonderful book. And this year will come out another book about post-materialist science, which means we have to include subjective experiences. And as I told you, we cannot objectify, reproduce, or measure, or falsify the content of our consciousness. Consciousness cannot be proven. So for a lot of scientists, it's not there, it's just an illusion. It's just the brain. And the skeptic responses are more on websites than personally done. They don't want to discuss it. I don't know, it's the same with Rupert Sheldrake, who's a brilliant man, who's also brilliant in responding to skeptics. And when he's discussing about the research, and then once he asked to a skeptical thing, it was Dennett, said, did you read it? Oh no, I don't need to read it, I know already. So that's the problem with skeptics. I call it prejudice and willful ignorance. They don't want to read it because they're afraid that they have to change their ideas. And also I know that scientists mostly have a professional meaning and a private opinion as well. When you talk to them privately, they can say, well, perhaps you're right. But they're afraid to lose the research money, they're afraid to lose the position at the university. So they're frightened. And that's why the skeptics are so aggressive. You had a question there.
During my near-death experience, I had a choice of whether to come back or not. And I'm really curious if you ran across that in your studies and how far did you go in that aspect?
Well, not only just in our study we did, but I have received thousands of emails from all over the world. I've talked to many, many people with NE, and they mostly always said that they came to a border, and then there was a voice or a light being or deceased relatives said, it's not your time yet, you have to return. And they don't want to return because they feel home. They feel the unconditional love. They feel accepted as who they are. They feel they're in contact with wisdom. They get all the questions, the answer before asking the question. So it's wonderful up there. It's home. So it's repulsive to be back in the body. They feel the consciousness is too wide to be back in this small body. It's also a problem for them. So it's a really problem to be back in the body, especially in the first years, which what I told you, but it's a traumatic, it's a spiritual trauma, with loneliness, depression, and homesickness as well. And it's especially a problem to accept, you can accept your enemy at the moment someone is able to listen. The problem is people won't listen, doctors won't listen, family members won't listen. We have done a study also in the Netherlands, 82 patients who had an NE in the past, with a mean interval of 24 years, between 7 months and 17 years. And it's we found that in a mean interval of 24 years, still half of them was not able to talk about it, to share any with others. So it's a huge problem. And when you keep silent about it, you cannot accept it, that alone you can integrate it. You first have to accept it, and the integration means that you change your life, they want you to live it. And it's hard in this Western world. As a joke, I always say, when you live in India, you get congratulations. But in the Western world, you will be ignored and ridiculed. But I know most of you are reluctant to come back. They don't want to. There was a question. Yeah.
Dr. Van Lommel, thank you for your unique perspective. It's the first time I've ever gotten exposed to such a broad and wide-ranging perspective on this. I've read other stories about NDE, I've been in groups, etc., but your perspective is very unique. I really appreciate that. I just wanted to ask you, what do you suppose that fear-death experience and near-death experience is so similar? They have such a similar. How can you suggest or heal that rift that happens, that you're saying in trauma, that happens in order to alleviate some of that?
The question is why near-death experience and fear-death experience can be identical. But the same question is for how can you have the same experience when you meditate, when you walk in nature? Or how can you have the same experiences when you are isolated, like Glenn Mitchell in the capsule in the astronauts, or Lindbergh who floating under the ocean alone? Why can you have the same experience in the existential crisis of depression? It means that you get out of your body and you will be with your consciousness in a higher realm, non-local realm, where you have the same experience. Also, deathbed fishes and the likes have the same content. So, the same content. So it's because you are in the same realm, but there is always a subjective aspect of this experience. Not everybody has the same story. First of all, it's ineffable. But not everybody will meet deceased relatives, not everybody will have a life review or a flash forward. But all these aspects are possible. So fear-death is also that you think that you will die in a near traffic accident. And the first scientific book about near-death experience or fear-death experience was by Hull in 1894. It was a Swiss man who had a mountaineering accident, and he had a sample, I think, about more than 20 people, most of them mountaineering accidents, who survived it by this kind of experiences as well. But there also be Plato has described this vision of Ur, a soldier who died, who had exactly the same kind of experience as we hear now. And the experiences we hear from the mystics are exactly the same. The shamans can have the same experiences. Indigenous people can have the same experience. So it's a universal experience that happened in all times, in all regions, and in all cultures. That's why it's the same. Yes?
Are you aware of or have you studied people who have attempted suicide and have come back? And is their experience?
The question is about suicide. I did not study it myself, but there have been publications about it. I quote it also in my book. There's in my book much more than just what I told you in 1 hour. But what they found is that people who attempted suicide and came back and had a near-death experience never tried to do it again. Because they now know that you try to get rid of the problems, but you take them with you and you cannot solve them there. You can solve them all only here in the body. So I know also for psychiatric clinics where people are suicidal, that they give them books about NDE or show them films about near-death experiences, because they can change the inside. It's useless to try to get rid of your problems because you have them always with you. It's a problem in your consciousness. So it's a helpful therapy when the suicide doesn't succeed.
find that in any of the people that reported their near-death experiences to you, that they were somehow instructed on the other side in how to, if they chose to return to their life or were told that they had to go back, that there was any kind of teaching that they received to help their life after they went back.
The question is also the kind of message they took with them to change their life, how to change their life. But what I hear from most of them, that they heard they had to go back because of a task to fulfill. But when they were back in the body, they said, I have no idea what my task is.
Exactly.
And but I think that the task is to integrate your experience and to show your love to others. And the unconditional love, firstly, is for yourself. You have to accept and have compassion towards yourself with all the negative aspects we have as well. You have to accept and love yourself. It's not egoistic. You have to accept who you are. And then you can accept others as well. And you feel connected with them. And the problem is the people who have come back, you feel connected with everybody, and with everyone, and with the nature, and with trees and flowers and so on. So you have to, sometimes you have to try to close down as well. But the task is not clear. But by living your experience, by integrating your experience, it will become clear. I think for most of you are sitting here, perhaps you don't know, but I think all people, as I told you, they were my teachers. And I think you don't have to have an end in yourself to change your life. So that's, I think all people and they are important for that. But they must be able to talk about it.
Sorry.
So I'm interested in your clinical data. How many percentage, you present a percentage of drug-induced out-of-body experience. So those are drugs, anesthetic drug or some other drug.
I don't understand the question.
So there is a table shows there's a drug-induced out-of-body experience.
Or the induced?
Induced.
What's the percentage of drug-induced?
Well, in ours, the question is about drug-induced experiences. In our prospectus, there was no drug-induced experiences. We could exclude pharmacological explanation for the experience. But there have been sometimes people who use LSD and DMT, ayahuasca, that have these kind of experiences, but they are quite rare. And it is dangerous to use it where you not really know about the doses and about people who are helping you to have this experience. Because a lot of experience can be frightening, can be negative, can be hallucinations. But sometimes with ayahuasca and even sometimes with LSD, experiences are reported that are the same as the death experience, but also transformation. And for me, transformation is important aspect of the experience. So induced experiences like stimulation of the brain never give any transformation at all.
Just a quick question. Do you have any sense of what distinguishes the instances where people are given a choice to come back to their bodies and when they are told they must go back to their bodies? Is there a particular
The
distinction
difference between?
In cases where people say people are told they must go back into their body, and in some cases, like two folks right here, they were given a choice to come back or not. Did you study that? And did you find any correlations there?
The correlation, if you were told to go back, or do you have a choice to come back? We didn't study it systematically, but I know that sometimes, let's say, women with a complicated childbirth say, I have to come back for my baby. Or sometimes they say, I have to come for my mother who is ill. Then they make a conscious choice. Because usually they are forced to come back. Usually, but sometimes they have an idea that they have an own choice.
I had
The question is that after your near-death experience, you have an enhanced consciousness continuously connected for everything.
Yes, whatever I wanted to know, I knew, and I had no thoughts for
Yeah.
6 weeks.
You were empty.
Emptiness, yes.
Consciousness was empty.
Yes.
So it means your consciousness was pure. All your thoughts and ideas are a content of consciousness. But pure consciousness is without content. It's without any ideas. It's just pure. It's light. It's empty.
Exactly. I
And-
felt empty. Did you, other people talk about
Oh yes, I've heard many more. But also, they cannot sleep for weeks because the energy is going on and going on and going on. It can be dangerous for the body as well. So I've met quite a few people who have this kind of experiences. Usually, it's just the enhanced intuitive sensitivity, but sometimes it even happens like you told me. It can happen.
reality wasn't solid. Reality wasn't solid. Everything was energy and light.
Yeah, exactly.
Nothing was solid.
So you perceive energy, you hardly perceive the physical world.
Exactly.
Because you're just connected with the essence of everything. So I know, but thank you for sharing. Yeah.
Yes, is it common for those who come back from a near-death experience to be able to heal themselves if they were seriously ill and also heal others?
That's
Yeah, more general.
what about the healing capacity of people, the self-healing capacity? It's obvious that they have a healing capacity and a self-healing capacity. Anita Morjani is a very famous example of it. But I know also people have been cold for 4 months, and within 1 week they could go home. Nobody have to be for weeks, for years in the hospital. And most of people then they have the healing capacity as well. They become an instrument for the universal healing energy as well. And usually they don't want to talk about it, but they help people. You see, you put a hand on the shoulder and a week later, thank you very much, that was the place where so they don't want to talk about it. But it is, it's clear that it's possible. So there's a change in the healing capacity, but also self-healing. There's a change in that they cannot have traditional, the medicine, normal medicine, they need a quarter of a half of what the dose because otherwise you got side effects of medication. So the body is far more sensitive for the medication we normally use as doctors. There's a change in electromagnetic energy as well. So lights change, computers fall out. So there's a lot of changes in the body because you had near-death experiences. And I write about it in the book as well. So I write all these kind of aspects as well. And but these are aspects usually people are very reluctant to share it with others. But I've heard many stories. Yeah.
Just a follow-up to that. You were talking about seeing others like that had passed away, some relatives or friends, and if it's been a long period of time and you see someone who maybe had died 10, 20, 30 years ago, what about the possibility that they have actually reincarnated, but at the same time, you can see a loved one who actually could also be in the body, in another body?
The question is, if you recognize that these relatives, when they died 30, 40 years ago, it's a possibility that they have already been reincarnated. But the first question is, what reincarnates? That's an important question. What about what reincarnates? So the Hindus and the Buddhists, but also anthroposophists like Steiner, believe that, like your personality, you either will reincarnate. I don't believe this concept. In this non-local realm, everything is kept, all memories. And when you connect with other people, you feel their own emotions and thoughts and other things as well. My personal opinion is that I will not come back. That aspects of the higher self, which is a right being, make the choice to come back to the other aspects. So it is still possible to be in contact with personality and aspects of someone who had died, but still reincarnated other aspects of the higher self. But I don't know. I don't know, because how do I know that someone will be reincarnated? So, I know for sure when they have lost a baby or had an abortion, and when they beat him in after that communication, they can be grown up. They become older as well, young adults. When they die as a baby. There is some change as well in the other dimension. But it's just what I hear.
I like the concept of death being another birth, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit about, I've attended birth before, and I have, because of that, felt elevated from that experience for a long time, months, and so I'm wondering about if death is it like another birth, then would it be a birth that takes place to change maybe into the next dimension, or what, because, and then when someone attends a death and actually is there when someone dies, do they get, you know, how when someone is born, it's like a bonding experience.
So the question is, what is the same about birth and death? I said in my lecture that death, like birth, may be a changing state of consciousness, which means before birth you have a state of consciousness where you are in a body, you have another consciousness, where you die, you have another change of consciousness. There is no beginning, no end to consciousness. So birth, we are consciously born, it must be awful because it was so beautiful then. And when you die, people here on earth think it's awful, but you're in the other dimension, with unconditional. So there's a continuity of consciousness before birth and after death, that's my opinion. It's a changing state of consciousness. It's always changing. Not also your consciousness changed, like yesterday or a minute or an hour ago was also changing. So it's a continuous change, but it's an essential change when you are being born or when you die. It's a different kind of consciousness. Okay? Yeah, yeah.
How can you get this information into the medical schools and the religious institutions of the world? Please plant the seeds.
The question about medical schools and etc. I lecture a lot for medical students, universities. I'm invited with them. I had last year 2 lectures on theological faculties in Germany, university, and one on university in Winchester, in the UK. So days about religion and about the electric business. So I lecture about hospices and hospitals, medical doctors. And then what I said, the younger generation is more open. The younger generation invite me to come to lecture because they know my book. So in the Netherlands it's the 22nd print already. So it's rather well known, and in Germany as well. The US not as much. But I think what I know is that my book, because it is scientific, is far more accepted in the medical community than books just describing some experiences. I don't know if you have read my book, but it is far more scientific because I write about neurophysiology, I write about quantum physics, I discuss about the role of DNA, etc. To understand and explain these kind of experiences as well. So I think the scientific approach is very helpful to get it more accepted in the general world. But there always will be very strict materialist scientists as well who don't want to hear. You had another question?
If you're relaxing, did you choose not to include unpleasant NDE experiences or hellish experiences, or were they universally positive? Did nobody volunteer some experience that was really frightening?
You need to get some of these questions before these people are 3 and 4 like that.
Yeah. So I always get the question about the frightening experiences. I know about 50% of the patients who have a positive experience have a frightening aspect. When they've been out of the body, they can come in a dark space, a dark room, which can be frightening. Then they experience a small light where they're attracted to it, describe it as the tunnel. But it's a frightening moment. And we don't know the exact numbers of people who just have a frightening experience and stay there in a dark room or go down. Perhaps 1 or 2%, perhaps more, because so reluctant to share it. I have spoken to several people who try to share the frightening idea with me, but took evenings for crying, so it was very hard. But there have been written articles and books by IANS here in the United States as well. And they describe the same as Dante has written in the Divine Comedy. But Dante has written about hellish experience in the hell is what these people tell us about. So there must be a kind of common relationship. It's also interesting when you read the book by George Ritchie, Return from Tomorrow. He's also in a kind of dark space where people are just interested in let's say, bad negative aspects of it. But there's always a light being there. And the moment they are aware of the light being, they can come out. But the struggle they have, they also have the struggle here in this on earth. But they was not aware. It is greed, it is whatever. And they still have the feeling of greed. And they get rid of it. They have to get rid of it. And that's the struggle.
So I have some questions here.
Yeah.
I am familiar with Eben Alexander and his book Proof of Heaven, and I also heard that he was very criticized and questioned, and I didn't spend time looking at the question that much, but I was wondering if you have any comment on this.
Well, Alexander is a good friend of mine. I've met him many times. Also, before he published his book, have in a conference where he shared it and he with others. He's an honest man. He's changed his mind totally, and he's able and willing to share it with others. And because he was a neurosurgeon, a lot of people trust him, but the science is reluctant, and they try to attack him in details. Like Sam Harris, who's a neurologist, who's written a very critical, with a lot of nonsense and untrue aspects. So it's again an attack by a debunker, by a skeptic who don't want to hear anything about it. And then they try to ridicule and make them untrue. This kind of people. It's attack the messenger. That's what they do. They cannot attack the, let's say, but they attack the messenger. And that's a very common way skeptics behave also on the internet. And nothing to do with what is really happening. And when you hear him talking, it's a wonderful guy, a wonderful man.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
No more questions.
Well, I'll ask the one you asked me to ask. In the AWARE study, when people were floating above the body, I hear that it kind of supposedly ultimately failed because they couldn't get a certain number of people to look at some object they put up near the ceiling. And maybe you can describe where the study should have focused its attention.
Well, the AWARE study is still
Can you repeat the question?
The AWARE study is going on about the perception of hidden signs somewhere close to the ceiling in resuscitation rooms. We did it also in our study. We had one resuscitation room where we had a hidden sign. But people are being resuscitated everywhere, in all rooms, and again in the elevator, on the street. So you cannot put everywhere a hidden sign. We had no patients who saw the hidden sign in our study. There have been studies as well, also done by Peter Sartori in the UK, with hidden signs. Never saw a patient saw this hidden sign. And also the AWARE study until now, there have been corroboration of variable aspects of this out-of-body perception. And no patient will now perceive this hidden side. And I told Sempane why. Because when we see or perceive, also in this world, we need intention, attention to perceive. When you drive a car, you don't see the landscape. The moment you concentrate on the landscape, you will see. When you're out of your body, you're so surprised that you're still there and that you can see your resuscitation or operation from above you. You know what people tell, you know what people do. You don't start to look around if there is somewhere hidden inside of you. And it is called inattentional blindness. You need intention and attention to perceive something. And I also call, in our body perception, is perception. It's not seeing. You see with your eyes, but with our body perception, 360 degrees perception. And you see the same amount of details and an overview at the same time. It's not like seeing, it's like perceiving. But you still need attention. When you think of your wife being at home, when you are being rested, you will be at home at the same time, and you will see your wife there in the kitchen. So you perceive when you have attention to it. And a quote also, scientific article about inattentional blindness in my book, like when you use your mobile telephone, there are more accidents, because you're not attention for the traffic. And then they say, well, I didn't see the car, but the car was at plain sight, but they didn't have attention for it. So it is inattentional blindness where people won't see the hidden side. So I'm sorry for Sempane, but I don't think there will be a positive result. But he has positive results for vertical perceptions. You could corroborate, but not the hidden side. Was that another question there? Or?
This side
Can I just?
Yeah.
I have a question about the hidden sign issue, and that is, when you're out of your body, are you perceiving surfaces in a different way? Are you perceiving more the essence? Would you even perceive, say, a handwritten sign or something printed? I know that Peter Fenwick was thinking of using a video screen to present patterns to NDEers. I would question whether the NDEers would even perceive that properly. Is that a valid question?
The question is, what can you perceive? And as Peter Fenwick and Sempane have doing together a lot of research and the research. So they had indeed laptops with random changing size. And the question is, when you are out of your body, can you perceive things on the screen? Now, I have met several medical doctors who had a cardiac arrest during heart catheterization, during stent or whatever, PTCA. And then they saw their own electroactivity heart getting flatline. So there is a possibility you can see something on the screen. But the problem is you're not interested in what's happening somewhere in the industry.
Definitely.
Totally. Okay, I think it's
We're going to have a workshop tomorrow from 1 to 4 at the Sunrise Center. Tim will pay us to drive in Corte Madera. And he will be presenting for 3 hours. And he will have some people there who have near-death experiences he'll talk to. And he will be showing a movie set.
right.
And he will be, again, answering questions. I stepped on the wire. So we can continue this then, because everyone's now getting sleepy and all that, and beginning to lose their questions. But we can continue tomorrow at that workshop that he's going to do. And the workshop is based on the same material, it just does it in a different format so you can really get into it.
So thank you for your questions.
Thank you.